something you wrote about it, which I think has a libertarian angle. But let's just start with, what was your take overall?
My overall take shows that I work in politics a little too much because my overall take, as soon as we got the news of the Dobbs ruling, I guess on Friday now, my take was thank God whomever leaked that draft leaked it, because I wonder to what degree that prevented some amount of shock to the system, some amount of surprise, and frankly, some amount of political violence that we really could have seen. I think we saw that decision that came down on Friday, and we could have seen a lot of turmoil and violence and people taking to the streets, rioting that weekend. And we really didn't see too much of that. So, in the month between the leaked decision and the ruling actually officially being handed down, we did see some attacks on crisis pregnancy centers and other pro life organizations that are very much doing excellent charitable work to help women in need who are pursuing alternatives to abortion. So, we did see some arson attacks, we saw vandalism, we saw some really horrible things. But I am sort of breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief that more violence didn't transpire after that decision was handed down. So I wonder, it makes me curious about the leakers' beliefs and profile and the degree to which that was sort of the calculated decision that they made.
I think that's a really smart take. So I don't think that the leaker had this in mind. I think that this is like an unintended consequence, but I agree with you. It was very fortuitous. My guess is the leaker was of the left. It's possible the leaker was someone on the right. But I think you're totally right about how it ended up, how it all shook out, right? I mean, as crazy as things were on Friday when the
Yeah.
decision came down, if it had hit people out of the blue, I mean, there would have been some degree. We knew that they were gonna, but I do think it could have been maybe twice as emotional and shocking as it was.
I think there was so much value. I think there was also value in the degree to which the draft that was leaked very much resembled the opinion that was ultimately handed down. We really weren't blindsided by this, and especially I think having looked at the summer. I guess George Floyd was killed in May of 2020, and then we saw that summer, really astonishing riots, terrible violence. We also did see lots and lots of peaceful protests where people were voicing their righteous anger, at cop malfeasance, I'm a libertarian. That's a perfectly acceptable First Amendment rights exercise. But we saw in 2020 a lot of pent up rage, perhaps some amount of pandemic fatigue, and people taking to the streets in ways that were really damaging to our civic discourse and to sort of the how we conceive of ourselves as Americans, I think. And so, I think we've seen different forms of political violence spring up in the last 2-ish years. And I, for one, feel somewhat heartened that on this issue, which is so hot button, and where
Yeah.
many people legitimately, like people like me, feel as though, this has been 50 years of genocidal acts of really like unacceptable state sanctioned killing that has become highly normalized. And yet, people on the other side, women of childbearing age, women like myself, very much feel like the these like bedrock foundational rights that they had relied on have now been seized from them very brutally. And they're fearful of the state. They're fearful of the surveillance and the intrusion from prosecutors that might happen depending on where they live, or that might happen to their friends and family. So, given how high stakes of an issue this is, I feel grateful that we haven't seen political violence in the wake of this.
Yeah. I should say that the leak could have gotten Brett Kavanaugh killed too, because, you know, there was this period of like a month where if one of the justices had been assassinated, I mean, at least people could think that that would have changed I don't know if it would have changed the outcome, but that they could have stopped it before the decision was officially handed down. And so the leak, I think ultimately the leak ended up kind of quelling violence and having us slowly get used to it as opposed to it being so shocking. But it might have turned out much more tragically. Um,
Yeah.
so I don't want to give the leaker too much credit.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that. I mean, I was on The Hills Rising a few weeks ago co hosting, and I did one of my monologues on that, on how, there was this crazy dude who traveled from, I think it was California, who was armed, who came to Brett Kavanaugh's house and then voluntarily turned himself in, clearly having some kind of mental episode, clearly a highly unwell person, but he was admitting that his plot was to kill Brett Kavanaugh. And this was something that, in my view, was somewhat undercovered by, mainstream organizations like the New York Times. We saw a very small, little tiny box on the front page, a little mention of it, so they could technically get credit for it, a cover your ass mention, if you will. But
Totally.
ultimately, it was hidden on page A20 or A24, like very, very deep within the physical newspaper, and mentioned in, I think, a single solitary article on the Times' site. I think it's fair to say, as a mainstream organization, we don't want to signal boost the crazies who inevitably hunt down high profile politicians and justices. But at the same time, we have seen a little bit of a strange normalization, especially from some very reputable corners of the left, that are saying things like, show up in full force outside of Amy Coney Barrett's house or outside of Brett Kavanaugh's house. Make sure they never get a restful night of sleep. Make sure they always feel a palpable sense of danger. If we can't be safe, make sure they don't feel safe and their children don't feel safe. And on one hand, I'm sympathetic to people taking this First Amendment maximalist approach, this idea of like our right to speech and to assembly is important and we ought to be able to demonstrate in all kinds of places. But also at the same time, I see that being almost a symptom of political toxicity. And I don't know what to make of that because I think it leads us to a darker place.
Definitely. I agree. So we've both hinted at this thing you wrote about period trackers
Mm-hmm.
for Reason magazine. Talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm interested in I'm always down to talk about my pro life beliefs because pro life libertarianism is something that's very important to me. And I think they're fully reconcilable with feminism and with libertarianism. But the thing that I also do have to grapple with as a libertarian is the degree to which there really are big surveillance implications to this. So even if I think the state is justified in crafting laws that prohibit a woman from killing her fetus, we also do need to consider how those laws actually legitimately get enforced and some of the terrible malpractice we see from prosecutors, or even the degree to which the law could now enable them to sift through all kinds of personal data that up until now they had no legal right to, but perhaps could now obtain through subpoenas and search warrants. So I think there's very reasonable, warranted surveillance concerns. And I'm always concerned about the intrusive state in pretty much all contexts, even if I think this is a somewhat
Yeah.
justified intrusion. So basically, there's been this whole wave of activists who've taken to Twitter and said, "Women, delete your period tracker apps," or rather, gestating people, people with wombs, people who gestate, whatever they term them now, delete your period tracker apps. Make sure those companies don't have data. You never know what could happen if you live in a red state. This data could be used against you. On one hand, it's a sentiment that is worth taking seriously. It's a fair one. On the other hand, like so many of the activist things that make the rounds on Twitter, it's kind of stupid because if you were in a situation where these are all predicated on voluntary self-logging. So if you were in a situation where you missed your period, you could feasibly fake log a period to just give this app the data that would allow, people to be thrown off your trail if you were actually worried about possible future prosecution, if you did plan on procuring an illegal abortion. So there's that. But then there's also the question of all the things a prosecutor would be looking to snoop into, of all of your digital footprint, would it really be this self-logged data in a period app, or would it be phone calls made to abortion clinics, search results, history of things you purchased on Amazon that might indicate what's happening with your body, text messages to friends where you overtly or explicitly mention these concerns and what's going on with you? In terms of digital evidence that could be gathered, your period tracker data is probably not the thing that they're going to be going after. So I think it's important for activists to be very clear about that. Like, if you actually want people to be careful about their digital privacy, encrypted messaging is a really good place to start, for example.
Interesting. Well, I love so I do love getting your perspective, and you and I are both pro life. And I have to say, I mean, the so many women and young women and women that I know and respect and really like were very passionately on the opposite side of this
Yeah.
from me. And it's a little it's interesting how just a different world, totally different worldview can be. Um, but I, the whole thing about like, this is my body. I don't want anyone. Well, okay, first of all, there's another life involved, right? But I do think that we have some sort of communal interest in life. And I think that there is a selfish side. I mean, in fact, if you go back to the COVID thing, right? Like, all the people on the right were saying, my body, my choice. That was their slogan that they used to talk about, don't, you know, and I was saying, like, well, you should probably get vaccinated because you could get someone who's vulnerable sick, and the cumulative impact to your community could be very bad, and unintended consequences, and yada yada yada. But it must just be just such a clear worldview difference. Of course, I'm not a dude. I mean, that will be in the blooper reel. Of course, I'm not a woman. I'm a guy. So you have a better perspective, or at least you're a better spokesperson for this. Like, why do you think it is that you see this differently?
Yeah, I think when try to take my pro-choice friends at face value, because I legitimately believe it's so difficult. There are so many people who I admire and profoundly respect on an intellectual level who come down in a very different place on this issue than I do. And it leaves me almost wondering, the phenomenon of like Gelman's amnesia, where it's like, you read about a topic you know a ton about, you read some journalist report of it, and you come away with like, oh, there were so many holes and how dare they, and they distorted this. But then you turn
Yeah.
right around, and on an issue that you know less about, you're very trusting of their reporting.
Yep.
um, there's almost this like slight Gelman's amnesia type situation with this, where on so many issues, I trust and respect tons of libertarian commentators and liberal journalists and people who come down in a very different place on this issue. But then in this issue, I see all of these strange distortions and logical leaps and things that I just don't think are accurate. But I think some of the difference in how we look at it comes down to a fundamental, for some people, this bodily autonomy argument, it's the end all be all. I think the idea that it's a distinct person that's developing with its own unique DNA, with major organs developed by week 11 or week 12, like very, very developed at that point. I think for some people, that's just not even part of the equation of what they're considering. And it's not because they're stupid or because they don't know that per se. It's because this bodily autonomy argument, this idea of like the fully formed, autonomous adult woman has to be the one whose interests we weigh above the interests of a fetus. And so it's something that's hard for me to relate to, because I think it's always good when people admit this conflict of interest, the interests of the fetus and the interests of the mother. But I think for lots of people, they see there being no logical way of squaring the two competing interests, and they just see it so clearly as being, we have to, whether we're individual moral actors or state entities, we always have to protect the volition of the mother, the fully formed adult, and the autonomy of the mother,
Yeah.
the fully formed adult. And I get that, but I can't help but feel that it sells such an important part of this short, which is that there's like this violence innate to abortion, this very violent act being performed. And I think when we attempt to act like I don't want freedom and autonomy that's built on the back of that type of subjugation and that type of violence. To me, that trade-off is not worth it. And I struggle from a moral level to see how that could be a good trade-off for anyone.
They're very passionate and angry about this, which is interesting because, again, you and I believe that there have been millions of, we know that there have been millions of babies who've been murdered.
Yeah.
Some cases, um, it was maybe in like less than 1% of the case, there were like rape or incest
Hmm.
exceptions, but in the vast majority of the cases, that was not the case.
Hmm.
And still, I'm not. I care deeply about the issue, but I'm not ready to fight anybody over it. Because I think politics should, like, I should be like, you have a different worldview than I do, a different perspective. But man, there is anger. It is something. I mean, it must be even more directed at you because you would be seen as like a traitor to the
Yeah,
cause.
like a gender traitor a little bit. I'm
Yeah.
also the most annoying type of gender traitor because I'm not only like feminist, it's very hard to put me in a specific box. Like I'm actively pregnant right now, but I don't really like babies that much. So I'm trying to like wrap my head around that one. I think there are so many people on my side where a lot of their understanding of this is it comes from a place of, I think, more emotion, the sense of like, how dare we as a society harm the innocent special baby creatures. And like, I take a much more scientific and clinical type approach to this, where I've always been fascinated by stages of fetal development. I've always been like the slight weirdo who will YouTube videos of abortion procedures just because I'm curious about what it is specifically that is being discussed or that's being defended. I want to understand, like, wait a second, so you have that all in there, and then what tool do you use to get it out? And like, what does that look like? And where does it go? And to me, that has always felt like such an essential piece of the puzzle in terms of formulating a moral perspective on it. But I understand for many people, it's coming from a place of more. There's more of a theological underpinning to it, or there's more of a very like visceral maternal protective sense of like these are our precious babies and we cannot do this to them. And I feel that a little bit, I guess,
Yeah.
sort
Well, I
of.
mean, the irony is that the same people, and this is not an original thought to me,
Yeah.
but it's just the same people who don't care that much about unborn babies really care greatly about whales and snails and whatever else it may be that might be feeling pain.
Yeah, right?
It
Like they
just
like
seems
banned plastic straws because we are worried about fucking turtle noses. Like, I don't care about. Are you kidding me?
it really seems, and I know like in other countries like in South America, like the liberals have been the pro-life people
Yeah.
because again, go back to the COVID debate. You know, it lines up that the pro-life person would be the person who is in favor of vaccinations, and the people who are saying my body my choice would be, it seems weird that these coalitions ended up the way that they ended up.
Yeah, you would think there would be more consistency with like people who preference bodily autonomy versus people who preference this idea of the common good, and that these would be somewhat consistent, dominant philosophies that would inform how we look at a wide spectrum of political issues. But, you know, you and I both know that that's unfortunately not how it goes down in practice. Um, One thing I always think about with this issue, though, is like the degree to which instead of fixating on the pro life or the pro choice thing, we can be a little bit more pragmatic going forward. Because I sort of think like politics is a toxic, evil wasteland. And a lot of people are much more amenable to sort of middle of the road compromises. But like this morning, I was looking at Guttmacher Institute, which is a pro choice research organization. I was looking at their reports from 2014. So they might be somewhat out of date now because that was 8 years ago, and they had statistics that were showing that some 51% of abortion patients in the US reported that they'd used a method of contraception in the month that they became pregnant. Okay. So we have half of people who are using contraception at all. People who are seeking abortions are not, by and large, people who are being cautious with their birth control. And so maybe that's one simple, easy, widely agreeable place we could start where we try to bring that number up so that abortions, to the extent that they're sought at all, are sought in the event of birth control failure, but not just because people are not using birth control at all or hoping the pullout method works, right? Like, there's a lot of incremental marginal steps we could take between where we are right now with 600,000 abortions performed in this country per year and where we want to be, which is for me is no abortions performed. Like, there's a lot of things we can do, right? There's a lot of tinkering at the margins.
All right, let's move on. I wanted to ask you about, you've written about these kind of cool cities like San Francisco and Austin and people moving there and talk about talk about what you wrote. Tell us the thesis.
Absolutely. I wrote a web feature for Reason called California's Competitors, which was published last week. And it basically explores the idea that you see frequently bandied about from a lot of the tech crowd that San Francisco city governance has failed them. Although so many companies were started and grown in the Bay Area, for many people, especially the richer they get and the more they want to grow their companies, living in California and specifically living in San Francisco is no longer a viable option for them. The tax burden is really high. There's terrible public safety and quality of life issues. And, a lot of them don't want to be spending $3 million or $4 million on a crappy piece of real estate where there's a bunch of homeless people, defecating on mattresses outside. Like, this is a common sentiment you see that's perhaps overblown to some degree, but I also think there's a lot of grains of truth. It's not something that's just an invented problem. I think there are legitimate quality of life issues. And so there's been this huge outmigration. And I think we saw the pandemic as a sort of catalyst for this to some degree. And a lot of these people have fled to Miami and to Austin. I think in part this is because both Florida and Texas are no income tax states. So if you're a really rich tech founder or, an impressively paid tech coder, like an engineer, it makes sense that the federal government is already snooping into your wallet, reaching its hands in and trying to replenish its own coffers. And you don't particularly want to give money over to state governments. You want to keep more of it for
Yeah.
yourself, which is perfectly defensible as far as I'm concerned. But basically, my thesis was attempting to suss out, okay, on one hand, I'm not hostile to the idea that, yes, San Francisco city leaders have squandered all kinds of public trust and really acted in terrible ways. And yeah, California's tax burden is awful. Get out, right? I'm not hostile to the idea that these competitor cities could be really, really good options. But I do also think there's a little bit of hype and boosterism from the tech crowd that's perhaps misplaced or that doesn't quite appreciate the degree to which you can't just replicate the sort of Bay Area creative ferment and pool of talent that really emerged over the last 30 years. You can't quite replicate that in smaller cities like Austin and Miami quite to the degree that these people are claiming. So I was basically interested in
Yeah.
talking to a bunch of
But
VCs.
they're not, I mean, it's not like they're in Martinsburg, West Virginia either. I mean, Austin
Yeah.
is a big city and a big state, and there's already a lot of talent there, a lot of creative people, the tech people, and it's a place where, same thing with Miami, and they're both types of places that people want to come, want to go. They
Oh,
want
yeah.
to be there. The weather's great. There's already a lot of creative people there, so I think maybe I'm more bullish on this than you are.
I am somewhat wizened and weary because I've been an Austin resident for 5 years and I've seen some of the city's changes, and my family's actually all from here. My parents were born here and I have a ton of family nearby. So to some degree, I think I've seen Austin develop and grow up over the years. And I personally incur some of the negative effects of that, as well as some of the positive effects. But I also think there's a degree to which it's like what I think will probably happen is these hubs will become specialized, but they won't replicate the dynamics of the Bay Area. So like I think we'll see really interesting like aerospace innovation in Miami, for example, and there's lots of cool crypto and web3 stuff that's going to be happening in Miami. But then in Austin, we've seen a lot of companies put their HQ2s here. We see a lot of sales talent. We see sort of like we used to have this big IBM, Dell type culture here. And I think some of that is still alive. And now a lot of these larger companies, have put a ton of workers here. So it's a little bit less of this like early stage innovative space and a little bit more for the developed larger corporate presence type thing, which is its own form of tech hub. It's just a little different than I think how people portray it.
Very cool. So everybody check that out at Reason. I think that's a super interesting topic. But you mentioned crypto. And so this will be sort of like when you go to your grandpa and you teach him how to use email. I would like you to explain crypto to me.
Oh no.
And should I be on it? Should I be investing or not?
Should I be on it? That's the most boomer way of phrasing that. You're not on anything. What are you talking about?
Should I be on the crypto?
You should,
Shakes
yeah,
fist at cloud.
you should get a crypto mail. Absolutely. Get a crypto.com mail.
Because
No,
some Nigerian emailed me and said that I should send money, and I just need to know if that's a good idea or
yeah, you
not.
need to know, you don't want to Western Union him, right? Like you need to find a new method. No, so I think with crypto, what's basically been happening, I see crypto as enormously valuable. Crypto has basically long been considered a store of wealth, verified by blockchain transactions, and it's sort of it's decentralized, it's verifiable. Um, it's a really interesting technology. I think there are lots of applications for blockchain technology in general, in terms of it being a way that we could store all kinds of contracts. Right now we have these third party entities, these middlemen, and all these bureaucratic institutions. You think about the process of like buying a house and how difficult it is and how many entities you have to work with to get a deed. All the technical documents that you need to verify that you are switching owners of a physical property. But blockchain could make a lot of that easier. Blockchain could make a lot of the verification process a little bit more streamlined. So I see it as valuable for like real estate applications as well as money applications. But in terms of Bitcoin specifically, I mean, what do you want to know about?
What is it?
Bitcoin is it's a store of wealth or a currency. I think people oftentimes act like you can just use it fully in place of a US dollar. But guess what? If you go to the grocery store and you try to pay them in Bitcoin, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. So I look at it less as valuable for processing in person transactions. And I look at it more as another thing, like when I invest in stocks that I'm
Hmm.
storing my wealth in. And I personally use Coinbase to do that. So Coinbase is less secure than if you did like a cold storage wallet, which brings it fully offline because Coinbase is subject to SEC scrutiny and federal regulations and all kinds of things. But they also make it a lot easier to convert from US dollars to cryptocurrency and back to US dollars. So for me, that trade off of less security for that ease of access is worth it.
Did you learn all of this because you're just into it and you're young, or was this part of your journalism to write about it?
I was sort of naturally interested in some of this. I'm always interested when with the whole tech crowd, I don't have a ton of technical knowledge of a lot of these things. I don't have like a coder's brain. I'm not wired that way. But when I see a bunch of really smart people who share my libertarian sensibility and ethos, who are all talking about the same types of things, it leads me to just wonder like, what are they on to that I'm missing out on? What I think to some degree it's a FOMO led interest where I'm worried that I'm missing out on it and there are all these smart people and if they're all circling around this one thing, there might be something there.
My oldest boy is really learning to code and he's into all this stuff. So it's just a matter of time until he's here to mentor me and to teach me, okay, pops, push this button now, so that'll be fun.
Well, I'm
Until
curious,
then, you're gonna have to be my coach.
I'm
Uh,
curious how early, like, what was your timeline for like internet adoption? Because I think we can
oh,
see some parallels here.
I was slow.
Really?
Believe it or not. It's funny. I was very slow. I did not probably have email until 1999. I remember I volunteered on Alex Mooney's campaign for state senate in Maryland. He's now my congressman in West Virginia in 1998, and they were astonished that I had never worked email or a fax machine. I guess I did. I guess 98 would have been the first time I did any email, but I don't think I had an email account till 99. But then the funny thing is, I became a blogger fairly early on after that. And then there was a time when, like, if you were a blogger, you were viewed as like a cutting edge on the cutting edge of like information technology. So I was treated as like an early adopter, but I think we're back to me being a late adopter.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the degree to which blogosphere world made it so journalists were relatively early adopters of the internet or more sort of nimble with using
Yeah.
the internet than many other industries would have been.
Yeah. I remember I wrote a piece when I was working at AOL's Politics Daily, which is now defunct, um, in like 2010, let's say, and it was like the top 25 journalists on Twitter. And it blew up, but there weren't that many. Like there were a ton of mainstream journalists who weren't on Twitter. Um, and I won't name any names, but I remember working at townhall.com, and there was like a young, at the time young, uh, still young for me, journalist there who's become prominent. And I remember, telling her I'm on Twitter, and she was sort of scoffing, like nobody cares what sandwich I'm eating for lunch. You know what I mean? And it's like now you have to be there, whether you like it or not. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So but when are you due?
I am due in early October.
Okay, so we've got some time. I'll get you on. We'll be able to have a couple more of these before before you go go dark for a little while. Um, well, it's not like you're going to be shipped away somewhere, but you know what I mean. Um, any final thoughts? Anything else? What should I have brought up that I didn't bring up today?
I'm trying to think. I mean, I'm curious about for both of us. Actually, a question that I have for you, because I
Yeah,
think you've been around conservative and pro-life circles longer than I have, is with all of the abortion discussion, I've seen a strain of gleefulness. And on one hand, I can understand it to some degree because I think, you look at the success of like the Federalist Society, for example, and the degree to which many people said they voted for Trump because they were playing this long game related to Supreme Court nominations. You see the degree to which many people have become part of the Federalist Society, and it's sort of served as this really interesting professional development organization for people of a certain ideological ilk. And I'm curious, like, on one hand, I could imagine people seeing the Dobbs decision as this culmination of lots and lots of very serious strategizing from the pro-life and the conservative side. And so there's a sense of payoff for that, and this idea that they've played the politics and judicial long game very successfully.
yeah,
But there's also this gleefulness that does rub me the wrong way. This sense of, well, wait a second, won't there inevitably be some really, really horrible effects of prosecutors being empowered to snoop into the lives of women? And won't this sort of drive our nation a little further apart? So how do you look at the gleefulness that we've seen on the conservative side?
I actually haven't seen the gleefulness, to be honest with you. I can tell you that. So I think that this is a testament to groups like the Federalist Society, who, you know, say what you will about what just happened, but Roe was thrust on the American public. Like
Oh yeah,
this was the supreme, like nine men telling us what to do,
with our bodies.
and yeah, exactly, and it also short circuited the legislative process and democracy. And instead of overturning the government, we decided to be very smart and to have this campaign to try to change it by virtue of, I think, going through the proper channels and working the system. And the Federal Society, then in '92 with the Casey decision, the Supreme Court essentially says, yeah, Roe is really wrongly decided, but we're going to invent new reasons to defend this right that doesn't really exist in the Constitution. We're going to we'll reverse engineer some new reasons. And so we had the rug, snatched out from under us again. And so the conservative movement, I think, stayed focused on building this infrastructure. And if you look at all of the different facets of conservatism, I would say it was the legal community that was the most effective, um, at playing the long game. And so I give them credit.
Yeah.
And I have to say it's something my whole life I've been working toward to some degree or another. I mean, I'm an opinion writer, an opinion journalist. I'm not really an activist, but like my wife is on the board of the National Right to Life March,
Oh
for
wow, I
example.
didn't
So
realize that.
some,
Cool.
Yeah, it's super cool. It's something we care obviously deeply about. Um, and I always, I just assumed, well, number one, I assumed Roe would never be overturned in my lifetime.
Yeah,
But
and
if you told me it was going to happen, I would have assumed that I would be like celebrating, um, because it's an amazing accomplishment. But instead, I was really greeted with, trepidation, like, oh wow, this is actually happening sooner than I thought. Like, I didn't
Mhm.
even think it was, but number one, didn't think it would happen in my lifetime. But then once it became clear, like, okay, this is going to happen now, like within a year, it wasn't like I didn't have time to sort of adjust to it. And then you see the other side's anger. Um, and so, long story short, I didn't see any celebrating. Now, maybe
Mhm.
there was something I missed on Instagram or something. But what did you see?
Well, it's sometimes it's people like, Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro and folks like that, who I sort of noticed a little bit of like there's a indulge in this type thing of like now's our moment. And I to some degree that's their brands, right? And so, that's
Owning the libs,
yeah, exactly.
basically.
Drinking the leftist tears. They have the little coffee mugs that they peddle that say that. And I'm against any coffee mugs that say anything on them. So I'm naturally categorically sorry, this is my role as the younger person. It's just to roast you until you can't take it anymore, despite all of your impressive work in conservative world. No, I think I saw some of that, and then I think I also saw to some degree a sense of detached joy from some of the pro-life women I follow, where at least for me, I was almost thinking like as soon as that decision was handed down, I was thinking of my close friends who've had abortions, and I just kept going back to how I need to very much watch my tone and my behavior. Not that I'm the biggest victim of the Dobbs decision, right? Like that's not what I'm saying. But there was a sense of like I need to watch my tone and my demeanor because people who I love very deeply are hurting so much right now. And it is important that we craft a way forward where as many lives can be saved, both fetal lives and fully grown women lives. And I'm
Yeah.
worried that we won't thread that needle. I'm worried that red state prosecutors will screw this up. And I just have almost like a fear that sort of set in this sense of like, wow, I really want as many people to live safe and productive and healthy lives as possible. And abortion is absolutely something that impedes that. But red state prosecutors might impede that too. And that leaves
Yeah.
me feeling really unsettled. And that doesn't, I mean, I'm Catholic. It doesn't leave me feeling, from a Catholic perspective, bringing the religion thing into it, which I don't typically do. There's just a sense of like, well, what's the appropriate way to feel, trying to balance all of these things because I am so worried about the ways that law enforcement will end up hurting, terribly marginalized people.
Yeah.
And I'm also worried a little bit about the degree to which, like, will our private social institutions be up to the challenge of ensuring that women who are in need actually fully get robust and consistent support? And I see that as operating outside of the state. Like, that's not a call for increased state funding of welfare, which I think we're going to now see that become even more of a political issue, which is something that could potentially expand the size of government and not be effective. But I just am sort of also wondering, like, are all of these private institutions up to the task?
I think that's a mature take or a mature response. I would like to celebrate. I would like to celebrate, not to rub it in anybody's face, but to celebrate the way that you might celebrate a World Series victory, that you've been building for decades. But um, that's not going to happen, and it's not a game anyway, and it would be perceived as dancing in the end zone, to mix my sports metaphors. So I'd like to celebrate, but I think that ultimately your response is the mature response, and also I do think that if you're a conservative, you're a libertarian, but as a conservative, if you're temperamentally conservative, then you are afraid of any big changes rapidly happening.
Mm-hmm.
You also understand unintended consequences and even things that are on net positive have bad side effects and byproducts. And so it's hard to really get excited about something, even though I believe that morally and in terms of and legally, uh, this was the correct decision. That's still gonna There's still gonna be a lot of backlash and uh, down. There's gonna be bad things will happen as a result. I think on that it's a positive, but it's hard for me to not have a sense of trepidation.
It's almost like how you described earlier in our conversation, the swiftness with which this was initially decided back in 1973 and then added on to in 92. It's almost like in order to undo that swiftly decided thing, there had to be another one like that. Um, but I do agree with you from like a very like conservative disposition standpoint. This sense of like, what does rapid change like this do to us? And to some degree, I can understand feeling people feeling a sense of like loss of faith in institutions, because ultimately the Supreme Court is supposed to act in a very conservative, and I don't mean conservative like what we're talking about in the rest of this conversation, but conservative in this very slow and discerning and measured and moderate, like a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator type way. Like that's
Yeah,
how the Supreme Court is designed to act. It's supposed to be very insulated from changing political whims. It's supposed to be a master class in this very careful examination of specific legal questions, and this idea that they have to percolate through all kinds of courts before ultimately rising to the level where some 1,500 cases or whatever are considered by the court, and then they accept a few hundred of them, or 100 or 200 to actually look at and make rulings on. And so it's by its nature such a conservative institution. And I share your fear that like what happens with this being feeling abrupt to so many people. Where does this lead us?
yeah. And I think that was John Roberts' instinct too. Um, but I also think like, you know, if you if your job is to interpret the Constitution and to judge to rule if something is constitutional or not, um, I think they made the right call. But I do think Roberts, in a sense, had that conservative instinct, and maybe if they had just stuck to the Mississippi decision as opposed to overturning Roe, it's hard to say if that would have. I wonder. The backlash might have been about the same.
Yeah.
The 15-week ban. So I don't know, but you know what I do like is that you've turned the tables on me. You have any questions for me? I can't tell you about Bitcoin, but if you want to know about something happened in like the 90s, now's your chance.
I'm curious, actually. Okay, my final question, and then we can end it because this has been wide ranging to say the least. My final question, and I don't know how much of an econ dude you tend to be, but are you a doomsayer about this current inflationary period that we're in? You know, we're seeing these CPI reports, these monthly reports of inflation year over year. You know, we saw 8.6 as I think the most recent one, which is really shocking. Before that, we saw 8.3% inflation. The month before that, we saw 8.5%. We're in a time of like weird, crazy hot housing market, really constrained supply in a bunch of areas, really high inflation, supply chain and logistics issues, a ton of leisure spending, like a ton of airport pass throughs right now, and sort of this huge, seemingly pent up demand where people are returning to summer travel this year, which doesn't seem to indicate that their pocketbooks are hurting. And yet gas prices are obscene. What do you
Yeah,
make of this weird economic state? Because you've seen more economic good and bad times in your lifetime than I have.
I have seen it all. Um, there's an episode of Matlock about this. No, um, I'm not an expert, but so I'm not too concerned. I would say a couple things. One, I'm really glad that they weren't able to pass, the Build Back Better, like all the money that like AOC wanted to spend. I could just imagine how bad inflation would be and how bad it would be long term if they had spent everything that the left wanted to spend. So thankfully, Joe Manchin nixed that. Um, So I also think the fact that the Fed is already raising interest rates
Hmm.
is like a good sign, and that I think that ultimately that's going to, it could create a recession, but I think it will. To me, inflation is just so scary,
Yeah.
and because I kind of remember the '70s a little bit, um, and it used to be something that people were so afraid of, and then we finally got to a point where it's like, oh, that could never happen again. So I'm not too worried, but it's something to take seriously, and I think it's politically speaking, just so bad for Democrats and Joe Biden. I mean, we just talked about Roe, and I've had two other podcasts today where I've had a debate as to whether whether there'll be backlash against Roe that will
Mhm.
redound to the Democrats' benefit, and I'm skeptical of that. But it could happen on the margins, and even it might just impact a Senate race
Yeah.
that could be the difference between who controls the Senate. So it's possible. Um, but yeah, I mean, if when you go to work and get off work, and then it now costs more to get gas while you were at work, gas prices went up and food prices went up. It's like that becomes a very scary thing.
It does feel like we're living in a moment, and it's funny because I don't have as much firsthand experience with this, but it feels like we're living in a time where like the inflationary period in the 70s is being repeated at the same time that some of the moral panic culture warring of like the
Yeah.
90s is being repeated. And we used to have so much political power of the sort of like Christian evangelical right that was really fomenting a lot of culture war, moral panic stuff. And now we kind of have both sides who were just sucking like so much. Like if we have to hear about the children and the drag queen story hour one more time, I feel like I'm going to have a conniption because it costs people so much money to get to work. And it seems like a misallocation of priorities for us to be freaking out about one thing when there are very real, very difficult things that are, really hurting poor people's and middle income people's abilities to even get to the jobs that they're working at. Like to me, that's such a Maslow's hierarchy. It's like, okay, guys, like we're gonna do story hour discourse again here on Twitter, really? Like, but it does feel like we're living in this infinite loop of these like strange eras in recent history repeating themselves, and they're coinciding in a way that's just tedious and miserable.
And on that happy note, I would say this was even better. This conversation was even better than our first one. So this is awesome. Great to talk to you. And I enjoyed you peppering me with some questions. So that was fun. Next time we do it, let's just plan on that. We can just go back
Yeah,
and forth, and you bring some questions. I'll bring some
I have
questions.
infinite questions. This is my biggest problem, which is that I'm always fascinated by what people are up to and what they're thinking about and where their heads are at. So,
Love it. Well, that's probably why you're a good host of The Rising, too.
thank you.
Um, so excellent. Follow her on Twitter. It's at Lizzie Wall.
Yes.
LIZZYWOL. Read her at reason.com. Liz Wolfe, thank you for coming back on the news.
Thank you so much.